They thought she was just another flight attendant serving coffee at 40,000 feet. But when both pilots collapsed over enemy territory with 200 lives hanging in the balance, Sarah Martinez was the only person on board who could bring them home. Alive, the pre-dawn light filtered through the crew quarters windows as Sarah adjusted her navy blue uniform jacket for the third time. Her hands moved with military precision, checking each button, smoothing each crease, ensuring her appearance met the exacting standards that had been drilled into her long before she ever stepped foot on a commercial aircraft. The gold wings pinned to her lapel caught the fluorescent light, but they told only half her story. To her colleagues at Meridian Airways, she was simply Sarah Martinez, senior flight attendant on international routes, known for her calm demeanor and ability to handle difficult passengers with quiet efficiency. What they didn't know was that those same hands had once guided a damaged C-130 transport through hostile airspace over Afghanistan. That the steady voice she used to explain safety procedures had once coordinated emergency landings under enemy fire. That the woman who smiled politely while serving meals in first class had logged over 2,000 hours of flight time as a combat pilot before an IED explosion left her with enough shrapnel in her left leg to end her military career, but not enough to stop her from walking away from the wreckage of her old life. Sarah made her way through the employee corridor of Ronald Reagan International Airport, her wheeled flight bag trailing behind her with the quiet efficiency that marked everything she did. Other crew members hurried past, chatting about weekend plans and passenger loads, but Sarah moved through their world like a ghost. She'd perfected the art of being present without being noticed, of blending into the background while maintaining a constant state of awareness that her former squadron mates would have recognized immediately. The flight manifest for today's route showed 847 passengers and crew aboard Flight 2847, bound for Frankfurt with a fuel stop in Bangor. Standard international service, nothing remarkable except for the weather system building over the North Atlantic that had already forced 2 route changes. Sarah had studied the meteorological reports during her break, noting wind patterns and pressure systems with the eye of someone who understood that weather could kill you just as surely as enemy fire. In the crew briefing room, Captain Davidson stood at the head of the table, his silver hair and confident bearing commanding automatic respect from the assembled flight attendants. His co-pilot, First Officer Reynolds, sat beside him scrolling through tablet displays with the casual competence of someone who'd never encountered a problem he couldn't solve with superior technology and established procedures. They were professionals, Sarah knew, but they were peacetime professionals. Their experience was built on routine flights, predictable challenges, and the comfortable assumption that systems would work as designed. Weather looks dicey over the Atlantic, Captain Davidson announced, his voice carrying the authority of 15,000 flight hours and an unblemished safety record. We might hit some turbulence around hour 4, but nothing the autopilot can't handle. Flight attendants, keep the passengers secure during the rough patches. Standard international service otherwise. Sarah nodded along with the others, but her mind was already working through contingencies that weren't covered in any civilian manual. She'd flown through weather that would ground commercial aircraft for days, had navigated by instruments when GPS satellites were being jammed, had landed on improvised runways while dodging surface-to-air missiles. The storm system building over the Atlantic was significant, but it wasn't the kind of challenge that kept her awake at night. The passenger boarding process began with its familiar rhythm of controlled chaos. Business travelers clutched their phones and laptops. Families juggled children and carry-on bags. Elderly passengers moved slowly through the aisles while Sarah and her colleagues guided them to their seats with practiced efficiency. She served drinks, checked seatbelts, demonstrated oxygen mask procedures, and answered questions about meal service, all while maintaining the pleasant but distant professionalism that passengers expected from airline staff, but her real attention was focused elsewhere. She noted the two men in seats 23A and 23B, who kept checking their watches and speaking in hushed Arabic, not because she suspected them of anything sinister, but because situational awareness was a habit she'd never been able to break. She observed the young mother in 31C, whose infant showed signs of respiratory distress, filing away the information in case medical assistance became necessary. She counted the exits, estimated evacuation times, and mentally cataloged the passengers who would be assets or liabilities in an emergency. During the safety demonstration, Sarah's movements were precise and economical, each gesture designed for maximum clarity and minimum wasted motion. The other flight attendants went through the motions with professional competence, but Sarah performed each step as if lives depended on it, because she knew that someday they might. When she demonstrated the oxygen mask procedure, her hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who'd actually used emergency oxygen systems under combat conditions. When she pointed out the emergency exits, she calculated egress times and crowd flow patterns with the eye of someone who'd supervised real evacuations under hostile fire. The passengers paid her the same polite attention they gave every safety briefing, their eyes already drifting to phones and magazines before she finished speaking. To them, she was just another uniformed airline employee, a pleasant but forgettable face who would bring them coffee and collect their trash during the long flight ahead. They saw the smile, the professional courtesy, the efficient service, but they missed the deeper competence that lay beneath the surface. Even her fellow crew members saw only what they expected to see. Linda Chun, the junior flight attendant, chattered nervously about her first transatlantic flight, seeking reassurance from Sarah's calm presence without understanding its source. Marcus Thompson, the senior purser, delegated responsibilities. With the easy confidence of someone who knew Sarah would handle whatever he assigned without question or complaint. They appreciated her reliability, her unflappable demeanor under pressure, her ability to diffuse tense situations with difficult passengers, but they attributed these qualities to experience and natural temperament rather than military training. Sarah encouraged their assumptions. It was easier to be underestimated, safer to let others take credit for her insights, more comfortable to remain in the background where her skills could be effective without drawing attention. She'd learned to translate her military knowledge into civilian terms, to offer suggestions that sounded like common sense rather than tactical analysis, to solve problems in ways that didn't reveal the depth of her expertise. As Flight 2847 taxied toward the runway, Sarah took her position in the aft galley, running through her final checks with the mechanical precision that had once kept her alive in war zones. The passengers were settling in for what they expected to be a routine flight across the Atlantic, confident in the technology and procedures that made commercial aviation statistically safer than driving to the grocery store. The pilots were reviewing their flight plan, trusting in systems and protocols that had been refined over decades of peaceful operation. But Sarah Martinez knew that routine was an illusion, that safety was always temporary, and that the difference between life and death often came down to having the right person in the right place when everything else failed. As the engine spooled up for takeoff, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the burden of knowledge that she hoped she'd never have to use, but couldn't afford to forget. The aircraft lifted into the pre-dawn sky, climbing toward an altitude where the air was too thin to breathe and the margin for error measured in seconds rather than minutes. Far below, the lights of Washington, D.C. faded into the darkness, while ahead lay the vast emptiness of the North Atlantic and whatever challenges the morning might bring. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. 2 hours into the flight, Sarah noticed the first signs of trouble that everyone else missed. The cabin pressure readings on her service panel showed fluctuations that were technically within normal parameters, but followed a pattern she recognized from her military days. During her combat tours, she'd learned that small anomalies often preceded major system failures, that the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophe could be found in the details that others dismissed as insignificant. She made her way forward to the cockpit, carrying the coffee service as cover for her real purpose. Through the reinforced door, she could hear Captain Davidson and First Officer Reynolds discussing the weather radar displays with the casual confidence of pilots who'd never encountered anything their training manual hadn't prepared them for. The storm system ahead was building faster than predicted, its edges already painting angry red splotches across their navigation screens. "Excuse me, Captain," Sarah said, balancing the coffee tray with practiced ease. "I couldn't help but notice the pressure variance readings in the cabin. They're showing a cycling pattern that might indicate a developing issue with the environmental control system." Captain Davidson accepted his coffee without looking up from the instrument panel. "The pressure's well within acceptable limits," he replied dismissively. "The environmental systems are all showing green." "Thanks for the coffee." First Officer Reynolds didn't even acknowledge her presence, his attention focused on adjusting their flight path around the growing storm cells. The message was clear. Flight attendants served coffee and managed passengers, while real aviation decisions were made by people with the proper training and authority. Sarah's insight, based on hundreds of hours of experience with similar systems under combat conditions, was dismissed as the well-meaning but uninformed concern of support staff. She returned to the main cabin, where her fellow crew members were preparing for the meal service with mechanical efficiency. Linda Chun was arranging dinner trays in the galley, her movements nervous and uncertain as she struggled with the complex logistics of feeding nearly 200 passengers. Marcus Thompson supervised from a distance, offering occasional corrections. But no real guidance, his attention divided between passenger requests and administrative duties. "The turbulence is going to get worse," Sarah mentioned quietly to Marcus as she helped organize the service carts. "We might want to secure the galleys and get the passengers seated before we start the meal service." Marcus glanced at the seatbelt sign, which remained dark, then shook his head. "The pilots haven't indicated any concerns. We stick to the schedule, unless we receive official word from the cockpit. That's how it works up here." The hierarchy was absolute and unquestionable. Information flowed downward from the cockpit to the cabin crew, never the reverse. Sarah's years of aviation experience, her understanding of weather patterns and aircraft systems, her ability to read the subtle signs that preceded dangerous situations, none of it mattered because she wore the wrong uniform and held the wrong position in the chain of command. During the meal service, Sarah moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, serving passengers while keeping one eye on the weather outside and another on the increasingly erratic readings from the cabin systems. The pressure fluctuations were becoming more pronounced, following a pattern that suggested the environmental control system was working harder to maintain equilibrium. In a military transport, she would have recommended an immediate systems check and possibly a precautionary descent to lower altitude. But Flight 2847 wasn't a military transport, and Sarah Martinez wasn't the aircraft commander. She was a flight attendant whose job was to smile, serve meals, and keep passengers comfortable, not to second-guess the decisions of qualified pilots who had access to far more sophisticated diagnostic equipment than the basic service panel. Displays she was monitoring. When a passenger in business class complained about feeling lightheaded, Sarah administered oxygen and took his vital signs with the competence of someone who'd performed battlefield triage. The man's symptoms were consistent with the early stages of hypoxia, despite the cabin altitude remaining within normal parameters. She noted the incident in her log and reported it to Marcus, who dismissed it as travel fatigue and suggested the passenger might be dehydrating. "Should I mention this to the cockpit?" Sarah asked, her concern growing as she observed similar symptoms in two other passengers. For one passenger feeling tired, Marcus shook his head. The pilots have enough to worry about with this weather. We handle passenger comfort issues back here. The invisible boundary between flight operations and cabin service was absolute. Sarah could diagnose and treat passenger medical emergencies, could manage crowd control during turbulence, could coordinate complex service procedures that required split-second timing and precise execution. But she couldn't question the fundamental systems that kept them all alive at 40,000 feet. As the aircraft approached the edge of the storm system, the first real turbulence began to shake the cabin. Passengers gripped their armrests and looked around nervously as coffee cups rattled in their holders and the overhead bins creaked under the stress of the aircraft's movement. Sarah moved through the aisles with the fluid balance of someone accustomed to unstable platforms, checking that seatbelts were fastened and securing loose items with economical movements. But her real attention was focused on the subtle changes in the aircraft's behavior that passengers couldn't detect. The autopilot was making more frequent corrections than normal, fighting against atmospheric conditions that were pushing the boundaries of its programming. The engine note had shifted slightly, indicating adjustments to power settings that suggested the pilots were working harder to maintain their planned flight path. Through the small galley windows, she could see lightning flickering in the distance, illuminating towering thunderheads that rose like ancient mountains into the stratosphere. The storm system was larger and more violent than the weather briefings had predicted, and they were flying directly into its path with the confidence of people who believed their technology could overcome any natural force. When Linda Chun stumbled during a particularly violent lurch, spilling hot coffee across her uniform, Sarah caught her arm and steadied her with the reflexes of someone accustomed to emergency situations. "Maybe we should suspend service and get everyone seated," she suggested quietly. "The seatbelt sign isn't on," Linda replied, dabbing at her stained shirt with a napkin. "We follow the cockpit's lead." Even among her fellow flight attendants, Sarah's insights carried no special weight. Her military experience, her understanding of aviation systems, her ability to read the signs of developing emergencies, all of it was irrelevant because she occupied the same position in the hierarchy as everyone else in the cabin. Her suggestions were polite recommendations rather than tactical assessments. Her observations were personal opinions rather than expert analysis. The environmental control system continued its irregular cycling, working harder to maintain cabin pressure as the aircraft climbed through increasingly unstable air. Sarah monitored the readings whenever she passed the service panel, noting each fluctuation and trying to predict when the system might reach its operational limits. In her military days, she would have been part of the decision-making process, her input valued as part of a team effort to ensure mission success. But on Flight 2847, she was just another member of the cabin crew, visible only when passengers needed service, invisible when real decisions were being made. The knowledge that might save them all remained locked behind barriers of protocol and hierarchy, waiting for a crisis that would finally make her expertise impossible to ignore. First indication of serious trouble came through channels the pilots weren't monitoring. While Captain Davidson and First Officer Reynolds focused on their primary flight displays and weather radar, Sarah was picking up fragments of information from sources they'd never think to consult. During her routine check of the passenger cabin, she overheard a conversation between two off-duty airline mechanics in row 17 who were discussing anomalous radio traffic they'd intercepted on their handheld aviation scanners. Air traffic control is routing everyone around a massive cell system that wasn't on the forecast models, one of them was saying quietly to his colleague. Commercial traffic is being diverted south by at least 200 miles, but military frequencies are reporting some kind of electronic interference in the same airspace we're heading into. Sarah lingered nearby, organizing magazines in the seat pockets while listening to details that would never reach the cockpit through official channels. The mechanic spoke in technical shorthand about radar anomalies and communication blackouts, affecting aircraft operating at their current altitude and heading. According to their intercepted transmissions, at least 3 military flights had requested emergency course corrections in the past hour, citing equipment malfunctions that occurred precisely when they entered the storm system ahead. When she attempted to pass this information to Marcus during the next crew rotation, he brushed off her concerns with bureaucratic dismissal. "Passengers overhear all kinds of things and misinterpret them," he told her while reviewing inventory sheets. "If there were real navigation issues, air traffic control would have contacted us directly. The pilots have access to the same information as everyone else in the sky." But Sarah knew that wasn't entirely true. Commercial aviation operated on different communication frequencies than military traffic, and civilian weather services didn't always share real-time tactical information with commercial carriers. During her combat tours, she'd learned that the most dangerous situations often developed in the gaps between different information systems, where critical data failed to reach the people who needed it most. Her suspicions intensified when she noticed the behavioral changes among passengers with aviation backgrounds. The off-duty Delta pilot in seat 12F had stopped reading his newspaper and was instead studying the wing outside his window with the focused attention of someone who recognized subtle changes in the aircraft's performance. A retired Air Force colonel in first class had quietly moved his family to seats closer to the emergency exits, a precaution that seemed casual but spoke to military instincts that civilian passengers wouldn't recognize. Sarah began making more frequent trips through the cabin, using beverage service as cover for her real purpose, gathering intelligence from sources the cockpit would never think to consult. She struck up conversations with passengers who worked in aviation, meteorology, and telecommunications, piecing together fragments of information that painted a picture very different from the routine flight status being broadcast from the cockpit. Weather researcher from NOA mentioned that satellite data was showing electromagnetic anomalies in the storm system ahead, something about unusual ionospheric activity that was interfering with GPS accuracy. A telecommunications engineer working for a defense contractor quietly explained to his seatmate that military satellites were reporting communication blackouts in a corridor that exactly matched their current flight path. An off-duty air traffic controller from Boston Center admitted to his wife that she'd never seen weather patterns like the ones developing over the North Atlantic. Each piece of information was small, seemingly insignificant when considered individually. But Sarah's military training had taught her to synthesize intelligence from multiple sources, to recognize patterns that emerged only when disparate data points were analyzed together. The picture that emerged was troubling. They were flying into a weather system that was affecting aircraft navigation and communication systems in ways that weren't showing up on standard civilian weather reports. More concerning was what she observed about the aircraft's behavior itself. During her years as a combat pilot, Sarah had learned to feel the subtle changes that preceded major system failures. The way the aircraft responded to autopilot inputs was becoming increasingly erratic, with small corrections that suggested the flight management system was struggling to maintain its programmed course. The environmental control system cycling had shifted from irregular to almost frantic, working harder to maintain cabin pressure as they climbed through increasingly turbulent air. When she checked the galley service panels during beverage rounds, the readings showed patterns that would have triggered immediate attention on military aircraft. Cabin pressure was fluctuating within acceptable parameters, but the frequency and amplitude of the variations suggested that the system was approaching its operational limits. Engine parameters showed similar stress indicators, with fuel consumption rates and exhaust gas temperatures climbing steadily as the autopilot fought against atmospheric conditions. Sarah documented these observations in her service log, noting timestamps and specific readings with the precision of someone accustomed to creating mission reports under combat conditions. But when she attempted to share her concerns with the senior purser, Marcus dismissed them with the casual authority of someone who'd never encountered a situation that couldn't be resolved through established procedures. The flight management system handles all those calculations automatically, he explained while reviewing passenger meal preferences. If there were any real problems, the cockpit would have alerted us. Your job is passenger service, not aircraft systems monitoring. The boundary between operational awareness and overstepping authority was clearly defined in commercial aviation, and Sarah's observations placed her uncomfortably close to that line. Her ability to interpret system readings, her understanding of weather patterns, her recognition of developing emergency conditions, all of it was irrelevant because she lacked the proper position in the hierarchy to act on her knowledge. Even her fellow flight attendants began to view her growing concern with mild irritation. Linda Chun commented that Sarah seemed unusually focused on technical details rather than passenger comfort, while the other cabin crew members exchanged glances when she mentioned her observations about the aircraft's performance. In their world, worry was counterproductive, and excessive attention to operational details suggested someone who didn't trust the system to function properly. But Sarah couldn't ignore what her trained senses were telling her. Every instinct honed through years of combat flying was warning her that Flight 2847 was heading into a situation that would soon exceed the capabilities of its automated systems and potentially challenge even the most experienced pilots. The question wasn't whether they would encounter a crisis, but whether anyone would listen to her when it finally became impossible to deny. At 42,000 feet above the North Atlantic, the crisis began with something as simple as a coffee cup falling from Captain Davidson's hand. Sarah was passing through the first-class galley when she heard the ceramic shatter against the cockpit floor, followed by a sound that made her blood freeze. The electronic chime of the aircraft's emergency alert system activating. The cockpit door stood partially open, revealing Captain Davidson slumped forward against his control yoke, while First Officer Reynolds clutched his chest, his breathing shallow and labored. Both men were conscious but clearly in distress, their faces pale and disoriented as warning lights began cascading across the instrument panel like a Christmas tree of impending disaster. "Get me medical assistance," Captain Davidson managed to whisper as Sarah rushed into the cockpit, his voice weak but urgent. "Something's wrong with the cabin pressure system. We're both experiencing symptoms of hypoxia, but the readings show normal cabin altitude." Sarah's eyes swept across the instrument panel, reading the displays with the fluency of someone who'd spent hundreds of hours interpreting similar systems under combat conditions. The cabin pressure gauge showed normal parameters, but the environmental control system was cycling frantically, working at maximum capacity to maintain breathable air. More critically, the navigation displays showed they were flying through airspace that civilian aircraft were supposed to avoid entirely. "Where exactly are we?" she asked, studying the GPS coordinates with growing alarm. First, Officer Reynolds tried to focus on the navigation screen, his hands trembling as he attempted to input commands. "We're off course," he admitted, his speech slightly slurred. "The storm system forced us north of our planned route. We're over disputed territorial waters between Russia and NATO boundaries." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. They weren't just dealing with a medical emergency at cruising altitude. They were flying an unidentified civilian aircraft through some of the most sensitive airspace in the world. Any military radar operator tracking their deviation from normal commercial routes would view them as a potential threat, especially with their communication systems compromised by the electromagnetic interference she'd been tracking for the past hour. Captain Davidson attempted to reach for the radio controls, but his coordination was failing rapidly. "Can't establish contact with air traffic control," he gasped. "All frequencies are showing static." The storm system is interfering with our communications." As if summoned by his words, Linda Chun appeared in the cockpit doorway, her face white with panic. "Sarah, we've got passengers collapsing in the main cabin. 3 people have passed out, and more are showing signs of oxygen deprivation. The automatic oxygen masks haven't deployed because the system reads normal cabin pressure. The environmental control malfunction wasn't just affecting the cockpit. It was slowly poisoning everyone aboard Flight 2847. The system was maintaining pressure readings within acceptable parameters while actually delivering air with insufficient oxygen content. In a military aircraft, Sarah would have recognized the signs of a compromised life support system and initiated emergency procedures immediately. But commercial pilots were trained to trust their instruments, and those instruments were lying. "Marcus is trying to administer oxygen manually," Linda continued, her voice rising with hysteria. "But we don't have enough portable units for everyone. What do we do?" Through the cockpit windows, Sarah could see the storm system stretching endlessly in every direction, its towering thunderheads crackling with the electrical activity that was jamming their communications. Below them lay thousands of miles of frigid ocean, while ahead stretched airspace, controlled by military forces that wouldn't hesitate to shoot down an unidentified aircraft that failed to respond to radio challenges. First Officer Reynolds was now unconscious, his head lolled back against his seat while automated warning systems chimed insistently throughout the cockpit. Captain Davidson was fighting to stay alert, but his cognitive function was deteriorating rapidly as the faulty environmental system continued to rob his brain of oxygen. "I need to declare an emergency," he whispered, reaching weakly for the transponder controls. "Set squawk code 7700 and try to reach someone on the emergency frequency." But even as he spoke, Sarah could see the futility of their situation. Their radio equipment was useless in the electromagnetic chaos of the storm system. Their navigation systems were showing increasing errors, and they were flying through airspace where an emergency descent could trigger an international incident. Even if they could establish communication with military air traffic control, explaining why a commercial airliner was operating without authorization in restricted airspace would require precious time they didn't have. "Captain," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to suggest, "you need to transfer control to someone who can fly this aircraft manually. The autopilot is following a navigation system that's being compromised by atmospheric interference, and both of you are too impaired to make the decisions necessary to get us home safely." Captain Davidson tried to shake his head, but the movement seemed to exhaust him. "There's no one else qualified," he managed. "Commercial aircraft require proper certification. The passengers would panic if they knew we had an unqualified person in control." Through the cockpit speakers, they could hear Marcus's voice over the cabin intercom, trying to maintain calm while asking passengers to remain seated as the crew dealt with a minor technical issue. But Sarah knew that within minutes, the oxygen deprivation would begin affecting cognitive function throughout the aircraft, turning 200 passengers into a panicked mob trapped in a metal tube, hurtling through hostile airspace at nearly the speed of sound. The moment of decision had arrived, but the authority to act remained locked behind protocols and procedures that assumed normal circumstances and qualified personnel. Sarah Martinez possessed the knowledge and experience to save them all, but using it would require breaking every rule that governed commercial aviation and trusting her life to skills she'd hoped never to need again. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Marcus Thompson stood in the center aisle of the main cabin, portable oxygen bottle strapped across his shoulders, like a medic in a war zone. But his efforts were proving woefully inadequate against the scope of the crisis unfolding around him. The standard emergency protocols that had been drilled into every flight attendant were designed for sudden decompression events, not the insidious oxygen starvation that was slowly affecting every person. Aboard Flight 2847. "We need to get these masks to the passengers showing the worst symptoms," he told Linda Chun, who was struggling to operate the manual oxygen distribution system with hands that shook from both panic and her own developing hypoxia. "Start with the elderly and anyone with respiratory conditions." But there were only 12 portable oxygen units aboard the aircraft, designed to handle isolated medical emergencies, not a systemic life support failure affecting 200 people simultaneously. Each bottle contained perhaps 20 minutes of breathable air, a temporary measure that would only delay the inevitable unless they could solve the underlying environmental control malfunction. Linda activated the emergency medical kit and began reading from the oxygen administration checklist, her voice growing more halting with each instruction as her own cognitive function deteriorated. "Place mask over nose and mouth, ensure secure fit, adjust flow rate to maintain patient consciousness." The procedures were clear and well practiced, but they assumed a limited number of affected individuals and a functioning aircraft systems to support the intervention. In the galley, another flight attendant was attempting to manually override the cabin pressure system using the emergency procedures outlined in their training manual. She turned the backup environmental controls according to the step-by-step instructions, but the gauges showed no response. The system was locked in its current configuration, responding to sensor readings that indicated normal operation even as it slowly poisoned everyone aboard. "The manual overrides aren't working," she reported to Marcus over the intercom system that was crackling with electromagnetic interference. "The environmental computer keeps resetting to automatic mode. I think we need maintenance personnel to bypass the control systems entirely." But there were no maintenance personnel aboard Flight 2847, and the technical manuals available to the cabin crew contained only basic troubleshooting procedures designed for minor adjustments, not fundamental system repairs. The sophisticated environmental control systems that kept them alive at 42,000 feet were beyond the repair capabilities of anyone in the passenger compartment. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Davidson was following the emergency descent checklist, with movements that grew increasingly uncoordinated as oxygen deprivation affected his motor skills. He initiated the standard procedure for emergency descent, reducing power and configuring the aircraft for rapid altitude loss. But the autopilot fought his inputs, programmed to maintain cruising altitude according to their filed flight plan. "Can't get the autopilot to disengage," he mumbled into his headset microphone, unaware that his radio transmissions were being absorbed by the electromagnetic chaos of the storm system surrounding them. "Flight management system keeps reverting to programmed altitude. Need manual override procedures." First Officer Reynolds was no longer responsive, his consciousness fading as the faulty environmental system continued its deadly work. The emergency oxygen system in the cockpit was functioning properly, but Davidson's impaired judgment prevented him from recognizing that he needed to activate it immediately rather than following the graduated response procedures outlined in their emergency manual. The aircraft's automated distress beacon was transmitting their emergency code, but the signal was being scattered and distorted by atmospheric interference until it became indistinguishable from the electronic noise generated by the storm system. Air traffic control centers hundreds of miles away were receiving fragments of their distress calls, but the garbled transmissions were impossible to interpret or locate precisely. On the ground, emergency response protocols were being initiated, based on Flight 2847's last known position. But search and rescue coordination assumed they were dealing with a standard aviation emergency in normal atmospheric conditions. The military aircraft dispatched to investigate their position were following standard intercept procedures, approaching from the south while Flight 2847 continued Its slow drift northward into increasingly sensitive airspace, the passengers themselves were beginning to react with the confusion and panic that accompanied oxygen deprivation. Those with medical training attempted to help their fellow travelers, but without understanding the systemic nature of the crisis, their efforts focused on treating symptoms rather than addressing the underlying cause. A retired emergency room physician tried to organize triage procedures in the main cabin, but his own cognitive function was declining rapidly as the environmental system continued its malfunction. "We need to get word to the ground," he told Marcus during a brief moment of clarity. "This isn't a standard medical emergency. Something is wrong with the aircraft's life support systems. The pilots need to know that this is affecting everyone aboard, not just isolated passengers." But the communication systems that should have carried this vital information to the cockpit were compromised by the same electromagnetic interference that was jamming their radio contact with air traffic control. The internal phone system between the cabin and cockpit was producing only static, while the emergency communication procedures outlined in their training manual assumed normal electronic systems and responsive flight crew. Every established protocol was failing because the crisis-facing Flight 2847 fell outside the parameters of conventional emergency response. The training, procedures, and equipment designed to handle standard aviation emergencies proved inadequate when confronted with a combination of environmental system failure, electromagnetic interference, and hostile airspace that created a perfect storm of cascading failures. Time was running out, and conventional solutions were proving not just inadequate, but counterproductive as each failed attempt consumed precious resources and further compromised their already desperate situation, while Marcus and the cabin crew struggled with inadequate emergency procedures and Captain Davidson fought against unresponsive automated systems. Sarah Martinez was seeing the crisis through entirely different eyes. Her mind wasn't processing this as a civilian aviation emergency with standard protocols and established solutions. Instead, her military training was analyzing it as a combat situation requiring tactical thinking and unconventional responses. Environmental control malfunction wasn't just a mechanical failure. It was a symptom of a larger system compromise that civilian pilots weren't trained to recognize. During her years flying combat missions over Afghanistan, Sarah had encountered similar scenarios when enemy electronic warfare systems targeted aircraft navigation and life support equipment. The electromagnetic interference from the storm wasn't random atmospheric disturbance. It was creating the same kind of systemic cascade failure she'd seen when military aircraft flew through zones of deliberate signal jamming. More critically, she understood something that Captain Davidson and First Officer Reynolds couldn't grasp in their oxygen-deprived state. They weren't just dealing with equipment malfunctions. They were flying an unidentified aircraft through military airspace without proper authorization or communication capability. Every minute they remained on their current heading was bringing them closer to an intercept by fighter aircraft that would view them as a potential threat, requiring immediate neutralization. Sarah's combat experience had taught her to think in terms of mission parameters rather than standard operating procedures. The mission parameter here wasn't following established emergency protocols or waiting for ground-based assistance that couldn't reach them through the electromagnetic interference. The mission was getting 200 people safely out of hostile airspace before military forces decided they represented a threat that needed to be eliminated. The solution required abandoning everything civilian aviation had taught about emergency response. Instead of trying to restore normal system function, they needed to fly the aircraft as if it were a damaged military transport operating behind enemy lines. That meant manual flight control, dead reckoning navigation, and emergency descent procedures designed for combat conditions rather than commercial passenger comfort. But the most crucial insight came from Sarah's understanding of international airspace protocols that civilian pilots rarely encountered. Their current position placed them in a corridor that multiple nations claimed as territorial waters, an area where unidentified aircraft were routinely intercepted and forced down by military fighters. The standard civilian emergency response of declaring distress and requesting assistance would actually make their situation worse, marking them as a priority target for military intervention. What they needed was to become invisible to military radar systems while simultaneously solving their life support crisis. Sarah knew from her combat tours that this required flying at specific altitudes and headings that would mask their radar signature within the storm system's electromagnetic chaos. More importantly, it required navigation techniques that used atmospheric conditions as cover rather than fighting against them. The environmental control system could be bypassed entirely if they descended to an altitude where ambient air pressure was sufficient to sustain life without mechanical pressurization. But civilian emergency descent procedures were designed for gradual, controlled descents that would take them through multiple radar tracking zones and expose them to interception. Military emergency descent techniques were designed for rapid altitude loss that used terrain masking and atmospheric interference to avoid detection. Sarah also recognized tactical opportunities that the flight crew was missing entirely. The storm system that was jamming their communications was also interfering with military radar tracking, creating gaps in coverage that could be exploited for undetected movement. The same electromagnetic interference that prevented them from calling for help could also prevent hostile forces from maintaining continuous tracking of their position. Her years of studying Soviet-era air defense systems during intelligence briefings had taught her the radar coverage patterns and response protocols used by military forces in this region. She knew the altitudes where civilian aircraft would trigger automatic interception, the headings that would take them through gaps in radar coverage, and the navigation techniques that could mask their movement within the storm's electromagnetic signature. Most importantly, Sarah understood something that no civilian pilot would know. There were specific radio frequencies used for military-to-military communication that operated on different electromagnetic bands than civilian aviation systems. These frequencies were designed to penetrate the same kind of interference that was blocking their standard distress calls. If she could reach the right frequency and use the proper authentication codes, she might be able to identify Flight 2847 as a civilian aircraft in distress rather than an unidentified threat. But implementing this solution would require taking manual control of an aircraft that civilian regulations prohibited her from touching. It would mean abandoning established emergency procedures in favor of combat flying techniques that could save their lives or kill them all if executed incorrectly. It would require convincing 200 passengers to trust their lives to someone they saw as nothing more than a flight attendant serving coffee. The knowledge was there, complete and detailed, refined through years of military training and combat experience. Sarah could see the path to safety with crystal clarity, mapping out navigation routes and tactical procedures that would bring them home alive. But the authority to act on that knowledge remained locked behind regulations and hierarchies that assumed peaceful skies and cooperative authorities. Time was running out, and with each passing minute, their options were narrowing as oxygen deprivation affected more passengers, and military radar systems began tracking their unauthorized movement through restricted airspace. The decision crystallized in Sarah's mind when she heard the first fighter jet engines cutting through the storm noise outside the aircraft. The distant roar was unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time around military aviation, and it meant their window for peaceful resolution had just slammed shut. Somewhere below the cloud cover, interceptor aircraft were climbing toward Flight 2847's position, following standard protocols for unidentified aircraft, operating without authorization in restricted airspace. She stood in the cockpit doorway, watching Captain Davidson's futile attempts to restore communication while First Officer Reynolds remained unconscious in his seat. The emergency oxygen system was keeping Davidson marginally functional, but his reaction time was severely compromised, and his decision-making ability was deteriorating with each passing minute. Behind her, she could hear Marcus coordinating the distribution of portable oxygen units to passengers who were showing the most severe symptoms of hypoxia. "Captain," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the chaos of warning alarms and electronic chimes, "we need to initiate emergency descent immediately. Military aircraft are moving to intercept our position." Davidson looked up from the radio. "Controls," his eyes struggling to focus. "Can't raise anyone on emergency frequencies. The interference is too strong. Need to maintain altitude until we can establish contact with air traffic control." It was the response of a civilian pilot trained to follow established procedures, even when those procedures were leading them toward disaster. Sarah knew that maintaining their current altitude and heading would place them directly in the path of fighter aircraft authorized to use deadly force against uncooperative targets. More critically, every minute they delayed the emergency descent was bringing them closer to the point where the oxygen deprivation would render everyone aboard incapable of rational thought. "Sir, I have relevant experience with military aviation procedures," Sarah said, stepping fully into the cockpit. "I can guide us through an emergency descent that will take us below the altitude where we'll be viewed as a threat, while simultaneously solving our life support crisis." Captain Davidson shook his head weakly, his hand moving toward the intercom switch. "Can't authorize non-qualified personnel to assume flight controls. Federal regulations are clear about pilot certification requirements. Need to follow proper emergency protocols." But Sarah could see in his unfocused eyes that he was already beyond the point where proper emergency protocols would save them. The regulations that govern civilian aviation assumed normal circumstances, qualified crew, and cooperative authorities. None of those assumptions applied to their current situation, where military forces were preparing to neutralize what they perceived as a hostile aircraft penetrating restricted airspace. "Captain Davidson," she said, her voice taking on the command tone she'd used when ordering emergency maneuvers under enemy fire, "you are no longer capable of safely operating this aircraft. First Officer Reynolds is unconscious. The cabin crew lacks the technical knowledge to resolve our environmental control malfunction. In approximately 6 minutes, military fighters will be within weapons range of our position." She moved to the co-pilot's seat, her hands hovering over the flight controls while Davidson struggled to process her words through the haze of oxygen deprivation. Around them, the cockpit warning systems continued their electronic symphony of alerts, each tone representing another system pushed beyond its operational limits by the combination of atmospheric interference and equipment malfunction. "I am a former combat pilot with over 2,000 hours of flight time in similar aircraft under hostile conditions," Sarah continued, her fingers finding the manual flight control switches with the muscle memory of someone who'd performed these actions under life-threatening stress. "I have the knowledge and experience necessary to navigate this aircraft safely out of restricted airspace while resolving our life support emergency." Captain Davidson tried to reach for the radio, but his coordination was failing as the faulty environmental system continued to rob his brain of oxygen. "Can't authorize ... regulations. Need proper certification ... Sarah made the decision that would either save them all or destroy her career forever. She reached across the center console and gently moved Davidson's hands away from the flight controls, her movements firm but respectful. "Captain, I am assuming operational control of this aircraft under emergency authority. Please remain seated and prepared to assist as needed." The moment her hands closed around the control yoke, everything changed. The aircraft was no longer following its programmed autopilot instructions, but responding to human judgment and tactical thinking. Sarah's fingers found the environmental control overrides, initiating emergency procedures that civilian pilots weren't trained to perform. Her eyes swept across the instrument panel, reading system status displays with the fluency of someone who'd learned to make life or death decisions based on incomplete information and deteriorating conditions behind her. She could hear the commotion as word of her actions spread through the cabin crew. Linda Chun's voice carried panic as she reported to Marcus that someone was taking over the cockpit. But Sarah had moved beyond the need for permission or approval. She was no longer a flight attendant following protocols. She was a combat pilot executing a mission to bring her crew home alive. The transformation was complete, and there was no turning back. Sarah's hands moved across the flight controls with the precision of someone executing procedures burned into muscle memory through countless training hours and real combat situations. Her first action was to disconnect the autopilot entirely, overriding the computer systems that were fighting to maintain their programmed flight path through increasingly dangerous airspace. The aircraft lurched slightly as it transitioned from automated to manual control, a sensation that would have terrified civilian passengers, but felt natural to someone accustomed to hand-flying military transports under combat conditions. She initiated what military pilots called a tactical descent, a rapid altitude reduction technique designed to move aircraft quickly through radar tracking zones while maintaining structural integrity and passenger safety. Unlike the gradual emergency descent procedures taught in civilian aviation, tactical descent used the aircraft's own weight and aerodynamic characteristics to achieve maximum rate of altitude loss while remaining within safe operational parameters. Beginning emergency descent to 15,000 feet. She announced into the intercom system, her voice calm and authoritative despite the chaos surrounding them. All passengers and crew, secure yourselves immediately. We will experience significant G-forces during this maneuver. The nose of the aircraft dropped sharply as Sarah configured the flight controls for maximum descent rate. She reduced engine power to idle and extended the speed brakes, using every available aerodynamic device to slow their forward velocity while increasing their rate of altitude loss. The artificial horizon on the instrument panel showed a descent angle that would have violated every civilian aviation regulation, but it was within the parameters she'd used dozens of times when bringing damaged military aircraft to safety under enemy fire. Through the cockpit windows, she could see the storm clouds rushing past as they dropped through the electromagnetic interference zone that had been jamming their communications. At 25,000 feet, she began the environmental control bypass procedure, manually overriding the automated systems that had been slowly poisoning everyone aboard. Her hands found the emergency manual controls that civilian pilots rarely accessed. Valves and switches designed for situations where computer-controlled life support systems failed catastrophically. The cabin pressure equalization was immediate and dramatic. Throughout the passenger compartment, people who had been struggling to breathe suddenly found themselves able to think clearly for the first time in over an hour. The portable oxygen units that Marcus and Linda had been desperately distributing became unnecessary as breathable air began flowing through the aircraft's ventilation system. Under manual control rather than the faulty automated management that had been gradually starving them of oxygen. But even as she solved their immediate life support crisis, Sarah was implementing the navigation procedures that would keep them alive in hostile airspace. She banked the aircraft sharply to the southeast, following a heading that would take them through gaps in military radar coverage that she'd memorized during intelligence briefings years earlier. The storm system that had been their enemy was now their ally, providing electromagnetic cover that would mask their radar signature from the fighter. Aircraft she knew were searching for their position. At 18,000 feet, she leveled off and began the delicate process of re-establishing communication with friendly forces. Instead of using the civilian emergency frequencies that had been jammed by atmospheric interference, Sarah tuned the radio to military communication bands that operated on different electromagnetic spectrums. Her fingers moved across the radio, controls with the confidence of someone who'd used these same frequencies to coordinate combat missions and emergency extractions. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," she transmitted on the NATO emergency frequency, using authentication codes she'd hoped never to need again. "This is Meridian Airways Flight 2847, civilian airliner with 200 souls aboard, experiencing emergency descent due to life support malfunction. Current position approximately 62 degrees north, 35 degrees west, descending through 16,000 feet. Request immediate clearance through restricted airspace and emergency landing assistance." The response came within seconds, transmitted from a military air traffic control center that had been tracking unidentified aircraft in their sector. "Meridian 2847. This is Keflavik Control. We have you on radar. Authentication confirmed. Emergency. Clearance granted for continued descent and heading 140 degrees toward emergency landing field. Be advised you have military escort aircraft approaching your position." Through the storm clouds below, Sarah could see the distinctive silhouettes of F-16 fighter jets taking formation positions around their aircraft. But instead of intercept posture, they were flying protective escort. Their mission changed from neutralizing a potential threat to shepherding a civilian aircraft to safety once proper identification had been established through military communication channels. Captain Davidson was beginning to recover as properly oxygenated air restored his cognitive function. But he remained quiet in his seat, recognizing that Sarah's actions had not only saved their lives, but prevented an international incident that could have resulted in the destruction of their aircraft by military forces following standard engagement protocols. The environmental control system hummed with new efficiency under manual operation, while the aircraft descended through clear air toward an emergency landing field in Iceland that appeared on their navigation displays like a beacon of salvation in the endless expanse of the North Atlantic. The Keflavik Air Base runway materialized through the dissipating storm clouds like a concrete lifeline stretching across the volcanic landscape of Iceland. Sarah guided Flight 2847 through the final approach with the steady precision of someone who'd landed damaged aircraft on far more challenging surfaces under significantly worse conditions. The F-16 escorts maintained their protective formation until the commercial airliner touched down with a gentle thud that brought spontaneous applause from passengers who finally understood how close they'd come to disaster. As the aircraft rolled to a stop on the military runway, emergency vehicles surrounded them with the coordinated efficiency of personnel who'd been briefed on the full scope of what had just occurred. Paramedics boarded immediately to assess passengers for lingering effects of oxygen deprivation, while aircraft maintenance specialists began examining the environmental control systems that had nearly killed everyone aboard. The Icelandic Rescue Coordination Center had mobilized resources for what they initially expected to be a catastrophic civilian aviation accident, but instead found themselves documenting one of the most successful emergency landings in recent memory. Captain Davidson sat in stunned silence as Sarah completed the engine shutdown checklist with movements that demonstrated intimate familiarity with commercial aircraft systems. His hands trembled slightly as the full implications of their situation became clear. A flight attendant had just manually flown a wide-body commercial airliner through hostile airspace, solved a critical life support malfunction, established communication with military forces, and executed a perfect emergency landing that saved 200 lives. The environmental control computer had a cascading failure in the oxygen mixing system, Sarah explained to the emergency response team leader who boarded to assess their situation. The pressure readings were normal, but the actual oxygen content was dropping below sustainable levels. Manual override was the only solution, but it required someone familiar with the emergency bypass procedures. The response team leader, a veteran of multiple aircraft accident investigations, studied the cockpit displays with growing amazement. "Ma'am, the flight data recorder is going to show a textbook emergency descent and landing. Your navigation through that storm system avoided 3 separate military intercept zones. How did you know the safe corridors through restricted airspace?" Before Sarah could answer, the lead F-16 pilot's voice crackled over the radio with information that would reshape everyone's understanding of what had just occurred. "Keflavik Control, this is Lightning Lead. The civilian aircraft executed military standard evasion procedures and used proper NATO authentication codes. Whoever was flying that plane has extensive combat aviation training. Request confirmation of pilot credentials." Marcus Thompson stood at the cockpit entrance, his face pale as he processed the radio transmission. The flight attendant, who had once been invisible to everyone who mattered, had become the person whose insights were sought by the most senior levels of aviation leadership. Sarah Martinez had not just saved Flight 2847. She had revolutionized how the industry thought about expertise, authority, and the critical importance of listening to voices that had been systematically ignored. Her office overlooked the runways where commercial aircraft took off and landed in endless succession, each flight now benefiting from safety protocols that had emerged from those terrifying minutes at 40,000 feet, when conventional authority had failed and unconventional expertise had proven to be their salvation. Today, Sarah Martinez flies again, not as a hidden expert serving coffee in the shadows, but as a pilot for specialized emergency response missions that require exactly the kind of unconventional thinking that once made her invisible. When conventional aviation faces the impossible, when standard procedures meet extraordinary circumstances, Sarah is the person they call. The flight attendant uniform hangs in her closet now, a reminder of the journey from invisible to essential. But more importantly, it represents something far greater than one person's transformation. It stands as proof that expertise exists everywhere, often in the places where we least expect to find it. Flight 2847 changed more than Sarah's career. It revolutionized an entire industry's understanding of where knowledge lives and how authority should be distributed when lives hang in the balance. Every commercial flight that takes off today benefits from the protocol she developed, from the courage she showed when following rules would have killed everyone aboard. The woman who was once told she was just support crew now trains the next generation of aviation professionals to recognize that true leadership doesn't come from rank or title, but from the willingness to act when action is needed. Regardless of who you are or where you sit in the hierarchy, sometimes the person with the solution is the one nobody's listening to. Sometimes the quiet voice in the background holds the key to everyone's survival. And sometimes being invisible is exactly the preparation you need for the moment when you must become impossible to ignore. What did you think of Sarah's incredible journey from overlooked flight attendant to aviation hero? Have you ever been underestimated because of your position? Or maybe you've overlooked someone whose expertise could have made all the difference? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your own stories of hidden expertise and unexpected heroes. And if you enjoyed this incredible true story of courage and competence, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're bringing you more amazing stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it matters most. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to share this story with someone who needs to remember that their knowledge and experience matter, no matter what their job title says.